All right. So welcome everyone. This afternoon we have Dr. Doug Markant here with us, and he'll be talking about his cognition lab and all the other cognition related responsibilities. Actually, Doug, I was thinking, Dr. Markant, I was thinking if you could maybe mention a little bit about the cognitive science program was with us. I think that would be helpful for students to hear about too. So Dr. Markant will be talking about different opportunities you can do with him through research assistantships, and also the cognitive science minor that we have within our psychology program. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction, and thank you to everybody else who is here for this. Let me just share my slides. Oops, let me go back to the beginning. Yep, so I'm Dr. Markant. The name of my lab, kind of informally, is the Learning and Decision-Making Lab. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm really a cognitive scientist. So this semester I've also taken over as the director of the cognitive science program at UNC Charlotte. If you're not familiar with it, cognitive science is referred to as the interdisciplinary study of the mind and intelligent behavior. It often involves core questions like, how does the mind allow us to do things which seem to be intelligent? Why do we sometimes do things which are not so intelligent? How do cognitive systems learn and remember? How do we perceive, represent, and reason about the world? How do environments shape the way that we think and what we can think about? As I said, it's really just an interdisciplinary field, so it's usually represented as being a combination of the fields that are shown here, including neuroscience, linguistics, philosophy, anthropology, psychology, artificial intelligence, or computer science, and education. My background is really kind of on the left-hand side of this figure. So I have some background in computer science, but mostly I've been trained as a cognitive psychologist. So I do a lot of behavioral experiments with people where I come up with clever games that are meant to test some hypothesis about how the mind works. I bring people into my lab. And often those are also driven by some computer models of some kind of cognitive process, right? So I'm testing theories about how the mind is working using behavior that I'm measuring in the lab. And so, yeah, we have a cognitive science program here at UNC Charlotte, including faculty from these different programs. If you're interested in this, then you're welcome to contact me to talk further about other opportunities to get involved. One of the key ways is that we have a cognitive science undergraduate minor, which involves a core course, Introduction to Cognitive Science, and then I think four other courses you need to take to complete the minor. So you can go to our website at cogsci.uncc.edu to get more details about that. But again, I always love to hear from students who are interested in cognitive science. And if you're just kind of curious about ways to get involved, then you're welcome to contact me. So let me just say a little bit more about the kind of work that I do in my lab before I open it up to questions. So we use behavioral experiments and computational modeling to investigate mechanisms involved in effective learning and decision-making. If I had to give it a tagline, it's about using cognitive science to understand and enhance human behavior. How can we use behavioral science to figure out how the mind works, and then based on those insights, come up with ways to actually improve behavior to help people make better decisions or to learn more effectively. So for my background, I usually describe the work that I do as being kind of the intersection of research on learning, memory, and decision-making. So for example, why is it the intersection of those things? For example, one thing I'm particularly interested in is how people make decisions about their own learning. So how are people active learners? How do they search for information? Are they able to tell when they're not following productive learning strategies? And are they able to kind of seek out help and those kinds of things? So we do some basic cognitive science research, and we also are interested in applications to a few different areas, including education. As I just mentioned, we think a lot about what are optimal or more effective learning environments. How can we apply these kinds of insights to actual instructional contexts? We also think a lot about health-related behaviors, in particular health-related decision-making. And then lastly, we try to relate this to artificial cognition. So thinking about, for example, artificial intelligence or computer systems that might help correct cognitive biases or help us to make better decisions or to learn more effectively. So I just want to give you a kind of idea of the sorts of projects that we're working on. So this is just kind of a sampling of things that are projects that are ongoing in the lab or which we're in the process of developing. The first one is about how people form relational knowledge through experience. So over time, as we get experience in the world, we kind of build up this internal model of how the world works, including the fact that we all kind of exist in this interrelated ecology, right? So an example that I like to use is something like a food web, where over time you learn how there are these relationships between different animals, including who is a predator and who is prey, right? Those individual relationships. And as you learn those facts, you kind of combine it together into your knowledge of this system. So how do we represent that knowledge? And then how do we use it when we're reasoning about systemic risks? So an example in this case would be, how do we think about the risks of climate change, for example? Like if one thing happens, like there's an overactive forest fire season, what are the effects within the kind of larger system, right? What are the effects on other parts of that same ecology? A second project that we're working on is how do risk preferences relate to people's ability to solve novel problems. So risk preference refers to people's tendency to engage in more or less risky behavior. Some people are just risk seekers, whereas some people, including myself, are a little bit more risk averse. So in this project, we're thinking about how that individual difference in your risk preference affects the way that you approach novel problems. So if I just gave you a kind of open-ended problem and ask you to generate solutions for it, if you're a risk taker in your daily life, does that cause you to come up with more risky kinds of solutions to those problems? Another ongoing project concerns how people detect changes in their own health. So this is, again, kind of underlying cognitive process, which is actually a sort of challenging thing to keep track of your own state. Like if you're having changes from day to day in some symptoms, for example, like changes in your mood, are you able to detect when those changes are of concern, right? So for example, are you able to tell when you've entered an unhealthy mood state where you've had prolonged periods of depression, for example? So how does that cognitive ability of being able to detect changes in your own symptoms, your own state, how does that relate to people's tendency to then seek help? And then the last project I want to mention is something that's a little more applied, something that we're doing in collaboration with computer scientists. And this is more about how people learn from data visualizations. And in particular, we're working on a project that looks at how people interpret visualizations of data, kind of like a scatter plot, which you might have encountered if you've taken a research methods course, for example. And we're trying to think about the kind of learning process that goes on when people interpret those charts or those visualizations. So in particular, people with different pre-existing beliefs might conclude different things, or they might be swayed to different extents by some data. So this might help us to understand why, people with different political views or different pre-existing opinions on an issue, they can look at the same quote unquote objective set of data and not necessarily come to the same conclusions. So this is another case where we're trying to understand that kind of learning process behind that kind of problem. This information is on my website, so I'm not going to go into too much depth about it. You've probably already kind of heard about these things in previous sessions as well. There are a number of ways to get involved if you're in the lab, if you're interested. Excuse me. You can volunteer as a research assistant, you can complete an independent study, or you can conduct an honors project. Those are the kind of typical ways that undergraduate students become involved. The kind of entry point into any of these is to just send me an email and talk to me about what you're interested in and we can figure out what works best for you. What do students typically do in my lab? What are the kind of activities that they engage in, what they learn? Again, a lot of things are maybe common to other research labs in the department. So you'll learn about responsible and ethical conduct of research, running behavioral studies with human participants. Eventually, hopefully that'll happen in a lab again, in our nice, beautiful, newly renovated lab. For the time being, we're doing online research. You learn about open science practices, which I can talk more about if people are interested in. Some students, if they are inclined, they learn about computer programming, so how to actually code up an experiment, how to do some aspects of data analysis, conducting literature reviews and writing research reports. And then a really big one is kind of along the way, you get a lot of advising on career opportunities, including things like applying to graduate school and what that process looks like. And then we have other lab activities, including occasional fun activities like escape rooms has been our most common go-to activity in the past few years. Okay, so that's a quick kind of rundown of the lab and what we're interested in. And now I'm happy to talk about any of your questions.
Students, do you have particular questions, or should I pepper Dr. Markant with some of the questions before?
Well, one of my questions was what kinds of tasks would a typical research assistant need to do for the changes in their own health in the health-seeking project? But I think you kind of answered that with the last slide, but I mean, you can go in depth if you want to talk more about that study or project.
Yeah, definitely. So we're kind of still working it out. There are a couple different ways to go about it. So one of them would be like you'd be completing a daily log of your own symptoms or other kind of health related information. You know, like what's your mood every day? How is your mood changing from day to day? And at certain times you might be asked, like, do you think that there's been a kind of underlying change in your mental health, for example? So this is something that's actually really hard for people to tell for themselves, because mood is something where your mood changes a lot, right? Your mood changes from hour to hour, maybe, certainly from day to day. And it could be that there has been an underlying change in your mental health state, right? You could, like, something could have happened and you've really entered into what we think of as an unhealthy kind of state, like depression. But it's hard for people to tell that, right? Because they're experiencing these daily fluctuations in mood. So one approach to this would be to just just study first whether people can detect these kinds of changes in themselves. We could also try to see if they can do it for other people, right? So for example, we could control the data that they're seeing, and like we can know that here's a person where, you know, after 20 days, something happens to them, they shifted into a different unhealthy mental health state. Can an observer of that actually detect that from the mood that they're seeing exhibited by that person? Does that make it more clear? Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes it more clear. Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question about your education research. Do you work with specific age groups, or is it just kind of general?
It's more general. In some work that I'm doing with collaborators, I do work with children who are usually like 4 to 7 years old. And that's an especially interesting age range for the kind of work that I'm doing, because there's a lot of development within those few years in cognitive abilities, particularly in this kind of domain known as executive functioning, which is kind of all about your ability to kind of hold information in mind, to kind of control your own thinking, that sort of stuff. Like during the 4 to 7 year old range, there are a lot of changes that are happening, which also coincide with when kids tend to be entering school. So some of the work that I've done in that area concern this question of whether children are good active learners. Like, are they able to search for information that helps them to learn about a new concept? And you can see, as you might expect, that there's a really big shift during those years where 4-year-olds, they're a little more random. Like if you give them an option of what to learn about, they're just kind of randomly picking things, right? But then 7-year-olds are suddenly really systematic. They know what what the right question is to ask in order to improve their own learning or to kind of move to the next step of their learning process. For the other stuff that we do, we're mostly focused on adult populations. Yeah, so like college student populations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? I know, Dr. Markant, just so students kind of continue to familiarize themselves with you, students have asked previous faculty what classes that you teach that they might be interested in taking with you.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. So at the undergraduate level, I teach research methods 2 and psychology of learning and memory, which is Psych 3111. Are there any other specific details that would be helpful?
And you all chime in. I think, I think it's just being able to kind of, have the contact with you in those different classes.
Mm-hmm.
Research methods too, in terms of our psych major requirements, that's one of the requirements we have to take in our research sequence. And the learning and memory class is one of the, let's see here, I'm trying to think of the category, human cognition classes or cognitive.
Yeah.
I know all these, and right now my brain has been through.
I think that's right. Something like that.
Out of the 4 areas, are knowledge-based areas, right? So yep. We have social, we have developmental, we have biological basis of behavior, and learning and cognition is the story. So that's a class to keep your eye out for in that category, as well as, like Dr. Markant was mentioning, we kind of have this separate minor that again emerges from our department with others, which is the cognitive science that he mentioned about too. So some students, you can do a psychology major and a cognitive science minor. It's not like you're getting 2 psych majors and minors. It's considered different. So a number of students do choose that combination. And I think that's a very good combination, of course, depending on what you're planning on doing as in the future, but that's a common one as well.
Would taking classes like Intro to Brain and Behavior and Human Cognitive Processes be good? Because my minor is biology. So would that be helpful in some of the things that you do in your lab, or?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, those are perfect kind of courses to take. And if you find those interesting, then it's likely that you'll enjoy the work that we do in the lab, yeah. So I don't really do any like cognitive neuroscience research in my lab. So I don't do neuroimaging or any other kind of method like that. But it's still very much, we get exposed to that kind of research a lot, and we use a lot of that research as inspiration for the kind of thing that we do. So it's really important to have that kind of foundation.
And for your research 2 class, I know it's more applied based. Is there a specific approach that you have to that class compared to other professors?
Yeah, good question. I think that, so I'll mention 2 things. So one thing, I'm not sure how different this is from other instructors, but one thing that I really emphasize in my version of the course is that you're really working on your kind of independent research project throughout the entire semester. So what I try to avoid is a situation where, we're kind of spending the first part of the semester focused on learning statistics or something. And then the second part of the semester, you have to kind of quickly come up with a study and run it and write the report and everything. In my class, I really try to get things started as early as possible so that you're completing the project and the paper in these smaller, manageable chunks, which means that you get more opportunities for me to give you feedback along the way. So by the time it comes to the end of the semester, you really already have most of the paper assembled together, and we've spent plenty of time going through that process. Because doing this thing of writing psychology research reports is a really complicated process. There are a lot of details, and so I find that it really takes a long time, and I wanted to spend enough time kind of working through those and helping students along. The other aspect that I'll mention is that along with Dr. Galati, we've been really interested in trying to incorporate open science principles into research methods too. Did she already talk about this at all?
She didn't get the chance to talk about it a little bit, but I've been bringing it up a lot in my classes as well. And I think students know a lot about it. I think it'd be helpful to all of us to understand it all a little bit better and what the angle is on the idea of open resource.
Yeah. So the idea behind open science is kind of this broad umbrella term for increasing the transparency of the research process. So that includes things like making all the materials that you use available, making sure that you've documented everything that's gone into the process, all the decisions that you've made along the way. And part of the intended effect is to also increase the reproducibility or the replicability of the research that we're doing. So I'm not sure whether you all have heard about this, but in the past 10, 15 years, there's been what's referred to as a credibility crisis in psychology. So there have been lots of kind of popular articles that you've seen, which have kind of questioned all of psychology research as being, founded on research that can't actually be replicated, right? This is kind of a fundamental principle in science, that we should be able to replicate each other's work and to build on each other's work. And there have been a lot of high-profile cases where that's turned out not to be the case. So there's been this whole movement in the past 10 years to kind of re-examine the process that we use, the decisions that we're making when we're conducting research, and to try to reform things to come up with research that ends up being more reproducible and that we can trust the results of more. So just to give you an example of that, one thing that has often happened in psychology research is that a researcher might, come up with an idea for a study. They have a hypothesis in mind. So they design an experiment around that hypothesis, and then they get the results, and the results actually turn out not to be consistent with whatever hypothesis that they went into it with. So what do they end up doing? Well, they look at the results and they say, oh, well, now that I've seen the results, that makes perfect sense. Like, I could have predicted that. Like, it's actually this other pattern, and that makes, total sense given this other background research and so on. So they kind of look at the results that they got and they alter the hypothesis that they write about in their paper. And the end result is that it always looks like we're constantly confirming our hypotheses when in fact, we're subtly changing it just to fit whatever results that we got. And this ends up being a really dangerous thing. It ends up really undermining the reproducibility and the credibility of the research that we have, because the results you got might just have been random chance, for example. And the next time that somebody comes and tries to rerun your experiment, they might not get the same pattern. Yeah, so that's one example. So in research methods too, one thing that we're trying to do more of is incorporate kind of these best practices for open science. So what do you need to know about to have, not faith, but have trust in the results that you get at the end of your study that will hold up over time?
Yeah, exactly. And even, on a practical level, we, through our classes, we say to you all, here's what the research says, here's what the research says. Often students ask me, well, I want to know more about the research, and I'll, present an article, we'll talk more, but all of a sudden students freeze up, they're like, we're not familiar with this research. Well, of course not. Now you do have access while you're in the university through psych info and whatnot, but the minute you graduate, you're off on your own and you don't have access to all these psychological journals and whatnot. I mean, it's very hit or miss what you can actually get your hands on in terms of articles. So to be encouraging you to learn all of this and use that as a tool and resource, and then you graduate, and if you don't go right into graduate school, you can't access these again, is a little counterintuitive and counterproductive. So to me, I'm all about this because, the greater issue is the integrity of our psychological science, but also the accessibility that this is just for a certain group of elite people that work in certain institutions, kind of thing. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is something I'm trying to do more of with my own research also. You can publish in journals that are so-called open access, where they're free for anybody to read. you know, this is kind of the ideal behind science, which we should be aiming for, which is it's a public good. You know, it's like we're just producing knowledge for the benefit of mankind. It shouldn't be locked behind the walls of a university or otherwise.
I'm keeping an eye on our time, although yeah, we can hopefully be a little flexible here, but we have 2 more minutes just to keep notice of the time. Any other questions for Dr. Markant? You know about the lab? Oh, please, go ahead.
What kinds of requirements or things do you look for in a research assistant to get into your lab?
So usually people are coming to the lab after they've taken something like research methods. So research methods 2, for example, is not necessarily a requirement, but it helps a lot to show that, you know, you took research methods and you enjoyed it. You did well in it. You've taken some courses that are related to learning, memory, cognitive science, something that has a connection to the lab and that you're interested in it. You know, so that's really big for me, is that just making sure that NRA has this kind of intrinsic curiosity or interest in the things that we're talking about, because otherwise it just ends up not really working out. People lose interest and are less motivated to work. But aside from that, I think it changes with each case. Like I really am open to anybody, even if you maybe don't necessarily have the typical background. One of the kind of principles of cognitive science, which I try to adhere to, is this kind of open interdisciplinary nature. We're really welcoming of different perspectives or people who are coming from different backgrounds. So even if you don't feel like you kind of fit the mold that I've kind of given you the impression of, but you're interested in either becoming involved in the lab or otherwise involved in cognitive science, I'd still definitely encourage you to contact me and we can chat a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Yes, I had a question about when someone does get into one of your labs, whether it be independent or whichever for it, what type of like training style do you guys have set up for anybody? Like, it's something nice and scaffold, or is it very independent? You know, kind of let them do what they need to do and check up, or I'm just interested in that process.
So I would say things are changing a little bit, especially nowadays. It's hard to know exactly what it's going to be like in the near future. But typically before all this happened, there'd be kind of 2 levels of mentorship or training. Usually there's a graduate student in the lab who's going to help to train a research assistant with a lot of the day-to-day activities of the lab. That includes like ethics training, you know, getting set up in the lab, being able to run participants and that kind of thing. But then I also typically with a research assistant will have ongoing meetings throughout the semester. So it's something where I try very hard to avoid what often happens in labs, which is that you meet the advisor or the PI in the beginning of the semester, and then you kind of see them again at the end of the semester, and you don't have other personal interaction. So usually if somebody is a research assistant in the lab, I try to kind of return, or I see the kind of trade as being like you're helping, volunteering, helping push forward my research, and in return, I want to make sure that you have an experience that's enriching for you and which helps to prepare you for whatever your goals are, whether that's to apply to graduate school or whether it's to learn a specific skill like programming or running behavioral experiments. So it really becomes tailored to each individual person, but I try to make sure there's frequent contact. So it'd probably be the kind of thing where I'm meeting every other week with the research assistants to keep track of these goals. Does that answer your question, or did you have something more specific?
No, actually, that answered it really perfectly for me. You know, it's pretty much a scaffold structure in that sense. I've noticed that really your studies are really parallel to health psychology as well. Is that kind of one of the interdisciplines that you guys also talk with? I know philosophy and computer sciences are definite with that.
Yep, so I'm a faculty member in the health psychology program also, and I have a graduate student, a PhD student who's in that program. Yeah, so it's another example of a program that we're kind of communicating with. And as you saw with that project that I talked about detecting changes in health state, that's one example of where we're trying to take something which is a core cognitive ability, being able to perceive changes in your own state, and apply
Yes.
it to what we think is a really important health-related decision-making problem.
Perfect. Awesome. Because I took Dr. Case's class, I remember those stages of decision making. That's really hit hard with me. So I really feel like your lab especially is highly applicable on a large scale for a lot of people. So that's nice.
Could I, before we end, could I ask to hear a little bit about the students that are here? Maybe if you just want to introduce yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, Joe.
If you just.
My name is Brianna Bush. I do have some research experience. I participated in the Charlotte Research Scholars Program this coming summer, and then I'm doing like research again with the same supervisor. It's more kind of biological, and then at first I'm getting some experience as a research assistant in Dr. Armstrong's lab in child and family development, but I'm really interested in like health and how it affects brain and behavior, and especially with developing chronic diseases or just emotional states. So I really think your lab is really interesting.
Great, thank you.
I can go next. My name's Jessica. I just transferred in. I'm currently in Research Methods 1, and it's going really by. I am really interested in a couple of things, but specifically in your realm is the learning and educational component. So I'm definitely going to keep looking into that. I am interested in working with children, so anything, that's why I asked about the age group. So 4 to 7 was really great. And yeah, I'm just really here to collect knowledge and get to know the faculty as well. So
great, thanks.
I'll go next. Well, I'm Josh Munn. I'm technically a junior, but I've been actually going to UNC Charlotte since 2010. And I remember the Cog Science program actually opening up with Dr. Paula Gulkasian.
Yeah.
That was interesting times. So it always kind of stuck with me over the years. I've been working at a vet clinic since then, and kind of learning the medical trade, as it will. And I really want to put in the care that we've had for other living things and what we can do, on the psychology realm to help improve things. I believe there's a lot that we can do and improve on that I want to bring to the table. But right now I'm really interested in cognitive neuroscience, neurobiology, even later on, God willing, psychopharmacology as well. I think there's a lot we can do. But these labs I've noticed in Dr. Levin's labs, your lab, Dr. Markant, these are really hitting home with me. They're really something that makes me feel comfortable, get the whole goosebumps and all. So I'm anticipating that, really. I'm looking forward to, what can be done in Culver, especially once things lighten up. I really like the place.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else? I can't actually, let's see.
Hey, I guess I could go.
Oh, great.
Name is Zion Salent. Yeah, I'm currently in Research Methods 1. I'm a transfer student as well, and this is my junior year. But I'm pretty set on stone and doing eventually getting my master's within clinical mental health counseling. But I'm not 100% certain of what I want to get that minor in, and just the idea of cognitive science and the cognitive psychology has always kind of definitely interested me, and it definitely can kind of go along with that a little bit, just within the decision making and things like that. So I just wanted to see, because I honestly didn't know as much as maybe some of the other students did in this Zoom meeting, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more about it, and yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Zion, those are good insights, because my background is clinical, and the information that I navigate toward in cognition is definitely the decision making.
Yeah.
And again, too, even the learning, because it's learning and relearning new behaviors and new ways of thinking, and so clinical, in my view, is very closely tied to whatever is going on with cognition and that sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
I think that's smart of you to make that connection. That's excellent.
Yeah. And you would definitely get some exposure to those more kind of clinical issues in my learning and memory course, and also the undergraduate introduction to cognitive science. It'll be less, of course, than a clinical course, but there's still some connection that would be probably useful to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you.
I'll go next. My name is Raven, and I just now this semester declared my psychology major officially, but I have taken lots of different psychology courses in the past. I'm a transfer student, so I basically took every psychology class that CPCC offered, and then I ended up here. I'm interested in cognitive science in the ways that it relates to developmental psychology. So I really enjoy that aspect of it, and I do want to work towards my PhD in clinical psychology eventually. I have an appreciation for all branches of psychology, so I'm always open to, exploring different paths, but I think my heart truly lies in clinical psychology, developmental processes, and cognitive science.
Cool. Great, thank you. Was there one more person?
Mackenzie, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. So I'm Mackenzie. I feel like my views kind of line up with Jessica with what she said. I'm really interested in your learning and education part of your lab. I'm currently in Research Methods 1, gonna move on to Research 2. But I did pick your lab to for the video because I was just really interested in what you had to say and what you are all about. I'm really interested. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. It's really good, especially nowadays. It's good to get to talk to you on a one-to-one level. So, and I really appreciate you coming to hear a little bit more about the lab. I do want to emphasize one more time, even if you don't think my lab is the right fit necessarily, it does sound like a lot of you have some interests related to cognitive science. So please do check out the website for that and look at the undergraduate minor. Part of that is also that you get added to our, if you enroll in the minor, you get added to our mailing list. You get to hear about talks that are on related topics and that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you. And you're always welcome to shoot me an email if you want to hear more about it.
Great, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, Dr. Markant, and especially to hear about the lab and the cognitive science minor. I think that's again, important areas to highlight, and smart of everybody to make the connections that we can't really exist without our cognition, right? So it's a foundational.
Very important.
That we should all be familiar with and see all the applications we can make with it. So fantastic. I appreciate all your time, and I'll see you, for whoever's interested. Last session is tomorrow at noon for anybody interested in honors thesis, and I'll post that up tomorrow as well. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.